Welcome to Sunday Ripple. I'm Rob Anderson, coming to you from Homer, Alaska. Each week, we take scripture and we follow it into real life. Honest conversations for anyone trying to figure out what faith actually looks like. Wherever you're coming from, you're welcome here. So let's get into it. Hey, before we dive into the episode, I just wanted to give everyone a quick reminder that last week was our 1-year anniversary of the podcast, and we launched a sticker. You can go get your sticker now at sundayripple.com. There's a support link up at the top, or you'll see the blog post about it right there on the front and center. You can grab your sticker today. You can throw it on your laptop, put it on your water bottle, your car bumper, your kid's forehead. It's a small, tangible reminder that small ripples really make a big impact. And if you've gotten anything out of the show over the last year, it's one small way to just help keep things going. All right, let's dive into the episode. Today, I want to talk to you about a fishing trip. A lot of years ago, it's been probably at least 10 years now. My son Jake and I, we went out. He couldn't have been more than maybe 5 years old at the time. And we went out on the water with a friend of ours. Our friend was captain of the boat, good guy. But Jake and I were running late, which, if you know me, is not really my character at all. But in the chaos of getting out the door, we got loaded up, barely got to the harbor before the weather made clear that it was not going to cooperate. Kachemak Bay was doing what Kachemak Bay does when it doesn't feel like cooperating. You know, wind, chop, gray skies, the whole thing. Fishing was awful. The water was so high that we were getting pushed around. We weren't catching anything. And eventually, our captain friend made the call. We're going to run across the bay to Seldovia. We're just going to grab some hot cocoa. It's been pretty miserable. On the way over, every single wave came over the bow, and every single wave hit my son and I. We just sat there and we took it in the face, literally, because there was nowhere else for us on the boat. There was a bunch of folks on the boat, and we just got pounded by wave after wave after wave. Now, if you've never been to Seldovia, it's a tiny village tucked into a little bay on the south side of Kachemak. No road access. You can only get there by boat or small plane. It is quiet in the way that places with no roads are quiet. So we pull in, tie up, made our way to the local coffee shop there, got some hot cocoa. Jake was perfectly content, albeit a little cold and very, very wet, but he was content, especially with cocoa in hand. So I called my wife. We had cell service, of course, over in Seldovia. I called my wife, told her that we'd be home around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And she said, okay, no problem. My wife and daughter, who was little at the time, couldn't have been more than 2 maybe. We're still back in Homer, and we didn't live in Homer at the time. So, we'll be back about 2 o'clock. And then we get back on the boat. We decide we're going to make our way back into Homer. And as we were headed back into town, the water calmed down, was actually pretty nice. The sky opened up. So we're like, all right, well, let's drop our lines back in. And so we did, and we're fishing. We're having a good old time. And the captain's sitting there munching on a sandwich, and that's when Jake looks up to me and he says, hey, I'm hungry. And then I started going through everything that I'd packed, and that's actually when it hit me. Nothing. I didn't pack anything. I didn't have a lunch. I didn't have snacks for either of us. So I'd walked over to the captain. I pulled him aside and I just said, hey, any chance you've got any spare food that you can let Jake have? Without even missing a beat, he's eating the sandwich. He just ripped half of the sandwich off. He'd maybe had a bite, rips half of it off, hands it to Jake. Wasn't a big deal at all. He just was sort of laughing, like, yeah, that's no problem. And just, here you go, kid. Jake took it, ate every bite, didn't complain once after that. And all the while, we're starting to get into the halibut like we'd planned the whole trip around it. It was awesome. We caught halibut. We got cod. Jake's having the time of his life. And none of us were paying attention to the clock even a little bit. We were out there until well past 2. We limited out on our halibut, and we got a ton of just awesome cod. Oddly enough, we didn't have cell service on the water. It said that we had, 1 or 2 bars, but no, we couldn't make calls out, no calls coming in. but my wife, Laura, couldn't reach us. By the time we finally pulled back into the harbor, she was in the parking lot of the harbor master in tears, genuinely scared that something had gone wrong. I called her from the dock, and she was relieved and exhausted, but also not entirely thrilled with me, which was totally fair. In the end, everyone was okay. Great fishing. Jake had a sandwich and his halibut story. My wife eventually forgave me, and I've thought about that day 100 times since then. Because it had everything. It had a plan that fell apart before we even got started, weather that made the decision for us, a detour into a place we didn't choose that turned into the kind of one of the warmest parts of the day, and then provision that showed up from somewhere else right when I couldn't fix it myself. And then when we finally surrendered to the conditions instead of fighting them, the best fishing of the trip. All of it happening while someone who loved us was standing in the parking lot, scared out of her mind. I mean, that's an Alaskan story. That's totally an Alaska story. But I've come to believe that it's also a God story. And today I want to talk about what this place, this specific, stubborn, beautiful, unmanageable place has taught me about God. I want to start with something that might sound a little unusual. I think that where you live shapes your theology. Not determines it, not replaces scripture or community or the work of the Holy Spirit, but it shapes it. Sort of the way a trellis shapes a vine. The same truth grows differently depending on what it's pressing against. And most of us, if we're being honest, have constructed lives in environments that confirm what we already believe. Places where the seasons are mild, the schedules are manageable, and the biggest disruption of your week is a slow internet connection or a backed up freeway. Alaska doesn't give you that option. There's something about standing off the shore of Kachemak Bay, looking out at the water with the Kenai Mountains behind it, watching the light do things to the sky that honestly seem excessive, like God's showing off a little. That does something to your categories. It doesn't just make you feel small, it makes you feel like located, like placed. Like you're standing in a specific spot on a specific piece of earth that someone put there on purpose, and you just happen to be the person standing in it right now. Psalm 19 opens with, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." I've read that verse a lot. I didn't feel it the same way until I watched the northern lights move across the sky on a clear January night from my driveway. Or, drove the highway in October when the birch trees are yellow and the mountains have their first snow and the whole thing looks like it was staged by someone who takes light very seriously. The landscape just preaches here. Not in a soft, inspirational screensaver kind of way. It's you are not running this and you never were kind of way. Romans 1:20 says that God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen through what has been made. The creation isn't silent. It is constantly, persistently, sometimes loudly declaring something about its maker. And I think some environments shout that louder than others. Not because God is more present here, but because there's less competing noise, less architecture telling you that humans are in charge, less infrastructure suggesting that we have mostly figured this out. Out here, the evidence that we have not figured out most of this out is pretty immediate. And that is, I have come to believe, exactly the kind of sermon most of us need and almost never get. I grew up going to good churches. I sat under solid teachings. I read the right books. But there is a specific kind of theological formation that happens when you are physically small in your environment, when the place itself is operating at a scale that makes your plans and preferences feel almost just tiny, just very appropriately sized. When you look out the window at a gray February morning and the mountains are just sitting there completely unbothered by your to-do list, and I don't know, just something in you settles. The landscape preaches. And if you live here long enough, eventually you start listening. Here's what Alaska demands of you that a lot of other places don't. It demands that you actually need people. Not as a nice community value to aspire to. Not as a spiritual discipline to practice on weekends. As a practical, daily, sometimes urgent reality. You need neighbors who know things. You need people who will show up when your pipes freeze or your car won't start and you're out on the water with no lunch and the weather's turning. You need a community that takes seriously the idea that we are actually responsible for each other. Because out here, that responsibility has real weight. I think about our friend handing Jake that sandwich. He didn't plan for it. He didn't make a speech about generosity or community or what it means to look out for each other. He just saw a need and met it. That is the texture of life in a small place at the edge of the world. People close the gap without being asked. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough that you notice it. Often enough that it shapes you. And here's what I've had to reckon with. I spent a lot of years treating self-sufficiency like a virtue. The guy who handles it, the one who figures it out, the one who doesn't need to ask because asking feels like admitting something unflattering about himself. I came to Alaska with that wiring largely intact, and Alaska has been a slow, persistent, sometimes humbling education in the opposite direction. Because the thing about Kachemak Bay is, it doesn't care about your self-sufficiency. It has its own agenda. And the sooner you understand that you are a guest here, not a manager, the better things tend to go. Genesis 2:18 says, it's not good for man to be alone. Now we read that as the setup for marriage, and it is, but I think it's something bigger than that. God made that declaration before sin entered the picture, before the fall, before the brokenness, before any of the things that make dependency feel risky. God looked at the situation and said, this is not good. You were not made to do this by yourself. Dependency is design. It's not defect. Needing other people is not a weakness to be overcome. It's how we were built to function. And places like Homer have a way of making that unavoidably clear. That fishing trip is a perfect example of how this actually plays out. I didn't plan for Jake not having lunch, but someone else provided. I couldn't control the weather. The bay made that decision. I couldn't will the halibut to show up. They came when they were ready. Heck, I couldn't even keep my own promise about what time we'd be home. Not because I was careless, but because the water had other plans. Every pillar of self-management I walked onto that boat with got quietly dismantled over the course of the day. And what I remember most about that day is not the catch, as good as it was. I remember the sandwich. I remember the warmth of Soldovia when everything outside was gray and cold. I remember the way the sky looked when it finally opened up, like it had been holding something back and decided to just let it go. The best things about that day were things I didn't arrange. I've had to sit with that for a while because it's true of a lot more than fishing. There's a specific kind of quiet that Alaska produces that I haven't found anywhere else. Not just the absence of noise. There's plenty of that. It's a silence that has a weight to it. A silence that doesn't flatter you or tell you what you want to hear. It just sits there, patient, unhurried, and waits for you to stop performing. I've driven out to the end of the Homer Spit on winter mornings when the fog's sort of sitting so low on the water you couldn't tell where the bay ended and the sky started. Just gray, cold, just the sound of your own breathing and whatever is actually happening inside you that you have been successfully avoiding all week. That kind of silence is not comfortable, but it's honest. And I think honesty is underrated as a spiritual environment. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah's at the end of himself. He's just come off one of the most dramatic moments of his ministry. Fire from heaven. Prophets of Baal, the whole remarkable thing. And now he's hiding in a cave asking God to let him die. He's burned out and terrified, and he has completely run out of what he had. And God, rather than giving him a lecture or a to-do list, sends him to the mountain and then shows up. Wind, earthquake, fire, loud, unmissable, and dramatic. God was not in any of it. After the fire, a still, small voice, a gentle whisper. That's where God was, not in the spectacle, in the quiet that came after. Most of us have built lives that are architecturally hostile to that whisper. We have packed every margin with something. A podcast in the car, a scroll before bed, a notification every 7 minutes, a task list that generates new items before you finish the old ones. We are so practiced at filling silence that we don't even notice we're doing it anymore. It just feels normal. In Alaska, it kind of forces a different pace, especially in winter. Especially when it gets dark at 3:30 in the afternoon and the bay is gray and there's nowhere to be and the silence is just there, waiting. You can fight it for a while. You can find things to fill it with. But eventually, if you're willing, you actually stop and something starts to come through. I've heard things in that quiet that I don't think I could have heard anywhere else. Not audibly, but clearly. The kind of thing that surfaces when you finally stop moving fast enough to outrun it. Things about where I was still holding on too tightly. Things about the gap between who I was presenting myself to be and who I actually was when no one was watching. Things that were gentle in tone, but not soft in content. The kind of truth that makes you wince a little because somewhere underneath all the noise, you already knew it. The silence up here doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It tells you what's true. And after a while, after you stop being afraid of it, you find yourself genuinely grateful for that because truth, even when it's uncomfortable, is a much better foundation to build on than the comfortable noise that was covering it up. I want to ask you something honestly. Is the God you carry around in your daily life big enough for an Alaskan winter? I don't mean that as a provocation. I mean it as a genuine question worth sitting with. Because I think a lot of us, myself included for a long time, have been operating with a picture of God that is essentially a slightly larger and more competent version of ourselves. A God who fits into our preferences and confirms our existing convictions and mostly stays in his lane unless we specifically invite him into something. A God who is available but not disruptive, present but not overwhelming. A God, in other words, who is manageable. And then you stand on the edge of Kachemak Bay in January and you watch a storm roll in off the Gulf of Alaska. The kind of storm that closes the harbor and grounds small planes and reminds everyone in a very practical way that this piece of water does not answer to anyone. And something in that manageable picture starts to crack. Not in a scary way, probably more of a relieving way. Because if God is big enough to run this, to hold the tides and bring the salmon back and keep the light returning after the long Alaska darkness, then he's big enough to handle the things I have been quietly convinced he might be struggling with. Job 38's, it's one of my favorite chapters. God answers Job out of the whirlwind. He doesn't explain anything. He doesn't give Job the backstory or the theological reasoning or the satisfying resolution. He just asks questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? It sounds harsh if you read it fast, but I don't think it's harsh. I think it's merciful. God's not cutting Job down. He's expanding Job's frame until the frame is big enough to hold what Job is going through. He's saying, you have been measuring me against your understanding, and your understanding is too small for what I'm doing. Living in Alaska has done that for me over and over and over again. Not by explaining anything. I still don't have tidy answers to most of the things I've been wrestling with up here, but by consistently expanding the frame, by putting me in a physical environment that refuses to let me shrink God down to a size that's comfortable. The God who keeps Homer, Alaska in place, who designed the tidal patterns of Kachemak Bay and decided when the halibut would bite and made the sky do those things in January, that God is not nervous about your situation. He's not behind on your problem. He's not surprised by the thing that is surprising you. When I remember that, when the landscape is holding that reminder in a way that isn't abstract or theological, the things I've been carrying start to feel like they're in better hands than mine. Which, it turns out, they always were. I want to be clear before I close. This episode is not a relocation pitch. Homer is extraordinary. The fishing alone, you heard the story. But God is not more present here than he is where you are. The grace that holds this place together is the same grace that holds yours. What Alaska's done for me is not exclusive to people who live at the end of the road system. What it is, I think, is an invitation to pay attention to the place you're already in. Because every person has a Seldovia, a place they weren't supposed to be, a detour they didn't choose, a season where the weather didn't cooperate and the plans fell apart and they ended up somewhere they didn't pick, waiting for the conditions they couldn't control to change, and something happened there that couldn't have happened anywhere else. A moment where provision showed up from a direction they weren't looking. A silence they didn't seek that said something they needed to hear. A sky that opened up right after they stopped trying to manage it. The question's not whether those moments are happening. They are. The question is whether you are moving past them fast enough that you never let them teach you anything. We are very efficient at resolving the tension. The weather clears, we catch the fish, we go home, we tell a good story. We turn the disruption into an anecdote and file it away. But sometimes the disruption's the sermon. The detour is the point. The thing that didn't go according to plan is carrying more theological weight than anything that did. Romans 1:20 says what can be known about God has been clearly seen in what has been made. The creation is not silent. Your circumstances are not random. The place you are living in right now, the season you are in, the things you cannot control about where you find yourself, all of it is speaking if you are willing to listen. I also want to say something about my wife in that parking lot because I don't want to skip past it. She was scared, like really scared. While I was out there having what turned out to be a great day, she was standing in the harbor parking lot not knowing if we were even alive. Our adventures in surrendering control don't happen in a vacuum. They happen inside relationships, and the people who love us sometimes bear the cost of the lessons we're learning. I think about that when I'm tempted to romanticize the days when things don't go according to plan. The day was good. It was also hard on someone who wasn't on the boat. Being present to the people waiting for us, really present, not just rushing back and turning it into a story, but being present to the people waiting for us, that's its own kind of formation. Pay attention to where you are. Let the place say what it's trying to say. Let the silence hold what it's holding. Let the things you cannot control remind you that something is in control. And that something knows what it's doing far better than you do. You don't have to move to Alaska for that. You just have to stop moving long enough to be where you actually are. Because I think you'll find, if you do, that you weren't supposed to be there by accident. And that someone already knew that. And that the best part of the story was always going to start from right there in the detour, in the waiting, in the place you didn't choose and couldn't have planned. The sandwich was already coming. As we close today, I want to say something to anyone who is in a season that feels like bad weather on Kachemak Bay right now. You're not off course. You may be in Seldovia, somewhere you didn't plan to be, waiting for conditions you can't control to change. But that is not the same thing as being lost. Sometimes the place you didn't choose is exactly where the formation you need is going to happen. Sometimes the provision you couldn't arrange is already on its way from a direction you weren't watching. God is not surprised by where you are. He was there first. You know what 13 years in this place has taught me, through the bay and the mountains and the darkness and the light and the days when the water cooperated and the many more days when it absolutely didn't, is that the character of God is written into the created world in a way you can't fully read from a comfortable distance. You have to be in it. You have to be small in it. You have to be wrong about what time you'll be home occasionally and find out that grace was waiting in the parking lot. Alaska taught me that, but the truth was always true. I just needed a place big enough to hold it. This week, wherever you are, find the Seldovia in your current season, the place you ended up that you didn't plan on. Sit there for a minute instead of rushing back out. Let it be warm, let it be quiet, and listen for what it's trying to say. And remember, small ripples make a big impact. Go make yours. Hey, before you go, I'd really love to hear from you. Whether this episode encouraged you or brought up a question or just made you think, you can actually send a message straight to us. It's an easy way to share your thoughts or your story or even just say hello. Just click the link in the episode description to reach out. I read every message, and I'd be honored to hear how God's moving in your life.